have to be a professional. And I tell people this all the time. What does a professional do in anything to be a professional? If you're a professional golfer, you're working on your putting 5 hours a day, right? You're at the driving range for 2 hours at 10 o'clock at night. You're learning and you're preparing. And so many salespeople don't do all the things necessary. Hopefully, there's a bunch of people listening to today's show who are going to take the lessons that you've taught over 1,000 episodes and the lessons that I've talked about over 550 episodes and in my new book, Insights for Sales Game Changers, and your new book. And they read it and they just don't rip it. They practice it. They write it down. That's like, I'm going to implement what Andy Paul says in chapter 3 today, and I'm going to implement what Fred talks about in chapter 10 about sales mindset. I'm going to implement some of these things because I truly want to become a more successful sales professional.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Fred Diamond. Fred is the president and co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales. Also, the author of a couple new books. One, a sales book titled Insights for Sales Game Changers, and a very personal non-sales book titled Love, Hope, Lyme. What family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. And we get into that a little bit later in the conversation. But first up, we're talking about some of the key points in his new book, Insights for Sales Game Changers. And we start by talking about why every sales interaction is a conversation that nurtures and grows a relationship. We get into why top sales professionals look at relationships differently. They have indispensable relationships, as Fred calls it, that pay off for decades. It's an investment they're making in their network as an asset. We talk about how to develop an optimal sales mindset, and we dig into some practical and powerful strategies for listening and questioning. We also explore why creativity is essential in sales and how to learn how to be creative. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before we get to Fred, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's jump into it. Fred, welcome back to the show.
Andy, it's great to see you. It's been a couple of years. I think it's been 6 years, but you've been on my show in between then. So
wait, 6 years since you've been on the show? No.
It's been a while. I was in a different office at the time, and we then brought you to speak in Virginia at the Institute for Excellence in Sales. And
yes, that was fun.
Yep, that was back in 2017. So
holy cow! Yeah, time flies. Did not see. I knew it was. Yeah, obviously it was pre-pandemic, but if you'd asked me, I would have thought.
Yeah, but we've kept in touch. Obviously, we've spoken many times since then.
Yeah, but still, wow. Okay. Well, welcome back. So, you gave people a little bit of a hint. So tell people about you and what you do.
Yeah, well, in this context, I am the co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales, and we're a member-based organization for employers. We help them attract, retain, and motivate top-tier sales talent. We're fortunate to have sponsors including Salesforce, Red Hat Software, IBM, Oracle, Cvent Software, Amazon Web Services. So typically enterprise B2B type of software, or type of technology or businesses, not really just technology. We have our Women in Sales program. We have our Premier Sales Employer. And our mission is to help them, again, attract, retain, motivate, and elevate top-tier sales talent.
Excellent. So you do that primarily through holding... Well, you got your podcast as one. You've also the Game Changers, Sales Game Changers. You also have events, as you said, that you do. What else do you do?
Yeah, we did. We have, prior to the pandemic, of course, we were doing a lot of live events. We were fortunate to have you as a speaker at one of them. We've made, like everybody, a pivot to virtual. We are back to doing some live events, typically in the D.C. area, Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based. But the majority of our stuff continues to be virtual. We have our Women in Sales Leadership Forum, which I'm so proud of. It's a leadership cohort for women in sales leaders, typically directors above, at enterprise sales companies. We have women, not just in the U.S., but in Europe, Asia, who are participating in that particular program, and we're very, very proud of it.
Very cool. Very cool. And now you've just published a new book sort of based on interviews you've done on your podcast. It's titled Insights for Sales Game. I could speak better different times. I don't know why it's so hard today. Insight for Sales Game Changers, lessons from the most important sales leaders on the planet. Though apparently I didn't make the cut.
Well, here's the thing. We have so much content. We have so much content.
I felt bad for a second. I'm not one of the most important sales leaders on the planet. I didn't make
Oh, you're definitely one of the most important sales leaders with the hundreds of thousands of followers that you have on LinkedIn and other platforms. And as you and I have talked about, you are kind of the godfather of sales podcasts. You were one of the first guys to create a sales podcast, and you basically set the tone for many of us who followed you, and including myself. And, here's the thing. We basically said, all right, we need to write a book. And one thing that we've been doing since day one of the Sales Game Changers podcast is we've transcribed every single episode we've ever done. And that's actually one of the best investments that I ever made for a couple of reasons. Yeah. One is people, as you know, we always want people to listen to our podcast because you could hear the inflection and you could hear the banter back and forth. But you know what, Andy? If someone's just going to read the transcript, I'm 100% okay with that as well, as long as they're consuming and accessing the content. Right. So when we decided to sit down and write a book, we said we have so much great content. Let's get some of the best examples from some of the first 450 shows at the time. Now we're over 550 shows and put them into a book and other formats. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a useful thing to do. I mean, it's you get a lot of different perspectives in it. And I think that's one of the real challenges in sales these days is getting people to not say change perspectives, but evaluate and listen to and consider additional perspectives to how they might be doing things.
No, that's a great point. And a lot of the VPs who have joined the Institute for Excellence in Sales said that they joined because their people have either stopped listening to them or, they need another perspective, if you will. Back to you, the way we created the book is we thought of the 30 most common words that have been uttered on the Sales Game Changers podcast. Those are words like empathy, leadership, prospecting, teamwork, listening. And we had some people on our team go and review all of the transcripts from day one. And what were some of the great quotes as it related to empathy or leadership or creativity or preparation? And then we narrowed it down to 14 of those words. But in the process, some of the words had 300 great quotes, and some had a couple of dozen. And one of our researchers said, wow, Fred, you have so much content here. You could do 6 books. And I went to my publisher. I said, we're going to do 6 books. And she said, let's get the first one done.
Let's do one first.
But we're already working on book number 2, which is Insights for Sales Game Changers, Women in Sales Leadership. And we've already created the framework for Insights for Sales Game Changers, Volume 3. And I'm sure you'll make an appearance in one of the upcoming ones over the next. Yeah.
I'll be able to sleep at night then. Okay, good. So, well, let's. What I want to do is sort of cherry pick things from the book to talk about because, it's lots of quotes from other people and so on. But your chapters are organized, you said, by these words and topics. So, I want to start chapter 3. Every sales interaction is a conversation that grows a relationship. So, what was sort of the best bit of advice that you liked from that chapter?
No, that's a great chapter. If you don't mind, I'd love to jump to chapter number 4, which is urgency. You need compelling reasons to act. And the reason I like that chapter so much was, we talk about that a lot. We could go through all the sales processes and we could, engage in conversations and talk all day. But if we don't have that urgency to get people to act, it's interesting. Some of the quotes through the book, Andy, are great. I've had people who've read the book and said, I've gotten so inspired, but we have to remember that we're in sales and our company needs us to do things that are going to help move the bar, bring in revenue, especially over the last 2 years when everything has changed. There was a great quote by Mike Schmidtman. Do you know Mike at all? Did you ever come across him?
I do not know him.
He's a sales trainer. He's based in Warrenton, Virginia. He holds mastermind groups. Most of his domain expertise was in the telecommunications and integrated communications world. And he made a great quote, which I'm going to read here. Urgency needs to be built in at the beginning of a sales presentation, the middle, and the end if you throw urgency only at the end, you're being salesy and pushy. So, that was a great point, because a lot of times we think that, okay, it's the end of the month, so our company is expecting us, so we're going to get really urgent at that point, or we're going to be urgent when the customer is not ready to be moved to the next stage. And that's actually something that ties back into the conversations chapter. Is all the conversations are meant to move you through the process.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting topic. I mean, I'm not convinced that in the main that sellers have a role in creating urgency.
I don't disagree with that. And if you create fake urgency, or if you push the customer too quickly, you're going to turn them off. One of the things that I realized in the book too, and you talk about this.
But it's a standard sort of trope in sales training is, that sellers have to create the sense of urgency in the buyer. And yeah, I just don't think that's the case. I think buyers are on that journey for a reason.
No, that's a great point. The only thing I would push back with on is your job as a sales professional is to generate revenue for your company. Now, if you can't create a fake scenario, I agree with that 1,000 times, because yes, the buyer is on their journey. It is the buyer's process, customer centric, etc. But you need to be conscious as a sales professional, and that's what keep coming up at that chapter as well. The other thing too, I think Dave Curlin.
Yes.
He wrote, of course, the book where he tied in baseball metaphors to sales, a great sales assessment leader. And he made a great point here, which goes to what you're saying. It's magical when the prospect and the salesperson both have urgency. There's alignment, and the sense is that they are collaborating together to get something important done. When only the salesperson has that urgency and the prospect doesn't, the salesperson will be seen as pushy and tone deaf. So yeah, you made a great point there. His book, by the way, is called Baseline Selling. It's synchronicity. It's being together. And it goes back to a lot of what we talk about, and you talk about in your book too, is that the mission of the sales professional is to help the customer achieve their goals, whatever it is at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're in sales. There's always going to be a sense of urgency, right? You've got numbers you got to hit. You have targets, and that's just a fact of life. But you also have to have sufficient breadth of opportunities in your pipeline that enable you to hit your numbers in a certain time frame, right?
And that's a great, yeah. And one of the things that, as I was reading all the quotes and thinking about the sales leaders, now we had two different types of people who participate on the Sales Game Changers podcast. We have sales leaders at companies, VPs of sales. As a matter of fact, prior to the pandemic, every interview I did was with a quota carrying sales leader at companies like Salesforce, Amazon, Cvent Software. I even interviewed the VP of sales for Dollywood, which actually was my favorite podcast interview of all time. Yeah, right. It was literally, I interviewed, her name is Cordelia Marzak. I interviewed her right next to Dolly's office in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. And it was a fascinating conversation. And, but the thing is, as I'm reading all these quotes, and the second type of people I interviewed were thought leaders and authors. People were targeting the show to sales professionals. Right. If you're a sales professional, you've dealt with thousands in your career. Think of all the things that need to go right for a sale to happen. Right. And you have to have that. I love Dave's quote, the synchronicity of you and the customer being in the same place so that you can, as a professional, move it quicker to get the customer where they need to go.
Yeah. Well, the synchronicity, I mean, another word for it, and people hate this word when I use it, but is luck, right? Is that you happen to, through hard work and through doing things you need to do, in terms of, outreach and so on, is you come across someone who is sort of, aligned with you relative to urgency. I mean, it's like meeting your spouse, right? It's what had to happen in the world for you to be in the same place at the same time to make that happen. And I think that's true with sales to a certain degree.
Did you ever listen to what's the podcast? Guy Raz's podcast.
Yeah.
I forget the name. Would you ever recall the name? Top of your head? Anyway,
No.
he interviews entrepreneurs who've been very successful.
Right.
And the
Like
last
how
question,
how I built this.
how I built this, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And the last question he always asks is, was it luck or something else that allowed you to be successful? And I used to hate that question because I would say, you know what, you're interviewing a guy or a lady who created $1 billion company and they just didn't wake up one day and had $1 billion company. They had to put themselves out there for those things to happen. The concept of the bluebird sale, right?
Sure.
That Ford Motor Company isn't going to call me right now and say, Fred, we want to give you $1 billion to do a podcast for us. But that's actually a bad example. But if I were selling things to Ford, and if I were that'd be great if they did. If I were focusing my whole career on the automotive industry,
right.
and if I had contacts, and if I did a project for the CEO of Ford 10 years ago, all of those things together. And one of the things that I've learned after interviewing all these great sales leaders, and most of them have had, Andy, 15, 20, 30-year careers. I've interviewed people who have been at Oracle and IBM and General Motors for over 30 years. You just didn't wake up and say, I want to be a VP of sales. I'm done working in a convenience store. Mm-hmm. No disrespect to people working in convenience stores. All those things that you've done for the last 20, 30 years have led to that opportunity, which fortuitously presented. I remember once I worked at Apple Computer for a long time, and we had guys who've been in technology for their whole career. These guys were in their 70s, and Apple moved into the government contracting space, which is where I was, and we had $1 billion contract. And I remember thinking, God, these guys just hit the biggest contract of their life in their 70s, right? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, how incredible is that? But then I said, well, they've been doing this for 40 years. And then Apple appears, the right product at the right time for the market. And they put themselves in that position.
Right. That was luck. I mean, it's okay. That's okay. That's the point I'm trying to make is it's okay. Things happen. I think one of the really big deals I got in my career is there's a guy's working for a startup. This what ultimately became the customer put out RFQ, if you will, pretty broadly, and we looked at it and it's for this massive system, and we were too small to even bid, right? We wanted to, but we couldn't, and we didn't have long story, but we were just too early in our development. And so they had all these, major tech companies respond, huge system integrators. Everybody wanted to do business with this company, huge telecom company. And they ended up not making a decision. Mm-hmm. And then 2 years later, knowing that they hadn't yet made a decision, I picked up the phone and called the decision maker and said, hey, what's going on? And that led to us winning the deal. But that was luck that they hadn't made a decision, right? I mean, maybe we could look at the thesaurus and have a different word for it. But it's basically, luck at the end of the day. And it opened the door for us and this transformed this company I was working with. It exists all the time in sales, and I don't know, as long as you're prepared to take advantage of it. I think that's what they call opportunity, right? Or luck when preparation meets opportunity. I don't know how we got down that path, but I think sellers, you're not denigrating your own efforts to just acknowledge that, there were some fortuitous things that happened that contributed to it, but you were prepared to take advantage of it, and that's great.
The key word there is the preparation. I mean, I don't want to spend the rest of the time debating the word luck. I've for a whole bunch of different reasons, I've come to the realization that it's the preparation. You chose to pick up the phone on that day, and luckily, here I say luckily, but in that particular situation, but you also chose to pick up the phone. Here's the thing too. It's like one of the things that comes through in the book as well is you put yourself in position to pick up the phone and to be in a place where your company could have helped that particular company. Like I said, if I picked up the phone and called that guy on that day, and it never would have led to anything because I haven't done the years of preparation to get there. And, one of the things too, another chapter that we focus on is chapter 5. It's creativity.
Yeah, no, I like that chapter. I was going to talk about it next. I mean,
Yeah, and actually I prepared some of the quotes from some of the chapters that I really enjoyed. And, when the pandemic kicked in, we shifted to doing a webinar, which led to a podcast every single day. And every Tuesday we did a show on women in sales. Wednesday I interviewed sales VPs. Thursday we did a show on mindset, which we'll talk about. And Friday we did a show called Creativity in Sales. Mm-hmm. And we kicked off this brand, if you will, of the Sales Game Changers podcast in March of 2020, because we said, you better be creative right now, because everything has gone out the door and the processes that we've all been prepared and deployed and trained on were really no longer valid for all the reasons that we're familiar with. So we spend every Friday, I think you might have actually been on one of those Friday shows, the Creativity in Sales, and we talked about just the concept of being creative. So there was a quote from a sales VP called Trevor Vail, and he was with a software company. He was based up in New York City, Canadian guy. And he said, creativity has to be incorporated into everything we're doing right now. We have to be creative in how we address new circumstances. We have to be nimble. We have to be able to pivot. The big word of the last 2 years, of course, pivot. We need to be prepared to change. So as a salesperson, if what you're doing isn't working, you better quickly try something else. And that's something that we saw, in the beginning of the pandemic, was people kind of holding on to how they had been operating. And we've had so many great examples of sales leaders that we've spoken to who have either insisted that their people rethink, or sales leaders themselves who have thought of new and interesting ways to get the conversation further down the path.
Yeah, no. Part of the reason I was interested in this chapter is sort of what you just talked about. Is we got to the start of the pandemic, and creativity certainly is a word that came up more frequently, as you said. Is we have to become more creative, more experimentation. It reminded me to some degree is also at the start of the pandemic is. Everybody said, "Oh, well, you got to lead with empathy."
Yes.
And my general reaction to that is, you always have to lead with empathy. This is not new. You always have to be creative. You always have to be experimenting. And it's like, okay, I think people are sort of missing the point. During the pandemic required people to be more creative, but I think it's the fact that prior to, and I think even not that we're necessarily through the pandemic, but subsequent to it, is people just fall back into patterns of behavior that aren't helping them improve. And this has been true in sales for a long time. And this idea is you didn't need the pandemic to tell you to be creative, as you need to be constantly reinventing how you engage with buyers. I would say still in general, we missed a huge opportunity during the pandemic to reset how we engage with buyers in B2B sales. And weren't as creative as we needed to be. Yes, to your point, some were very creative, and I've seen examples of that, but it's like, this is a daily demand in sales. And I think it's partnered with curiosity. And I think that, I believe that it's sort of the ongoing lack of curiosity that leads to this status quo behavior that we've seen resulting in, if we look at the data that's reported on sales, is falling quota attainment, things we're tired of hearing, win rates dropping, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, to me, that's driven by lack of creativity, which really is based on a lack of curiosity about what can we do different and what can we experiment with.
You raised so many great points in what you just said, and so chapter 7 is on empathy, and it's understanding what empathy is and what it's not. And, as I'm thinking about what you just said, if you want to lose weight, there's a million books and articles and organic companies that help you lose weight, but you have to decide, am I really committed to losing weight? There's no shortage. You go to the book Barnes and Nobles or Amazon, you type in books. There's millions of books. There's millions of people who've lost weight. So why can't everybody lose weight? Well, because you're not committed to losing weight. You're not creative enough to change your daily processes to put in the things that you need to put in to do what's necessary to lose the weight. I think the same thing applies in sales.
Or committed as well.
I said that.
Creativity.
Right.
I mean, it's being committed.
Which goes back to what you talk about in your book as well is, again, one thing I learned when we started doing the podcast during the pandemic, things changed. Everything changed. People weren't doing transactions for all the reasons that we're familiar with. And people were still, stuck on, okay, I'm going to tell my team they still need to make 50 phone calls a day. And we would hear that all the time for the first 6, 7, 8 months is people would reach out to me, Fred or Mr. Diamond if they were younger, or Fred if they were younger. My boss says I still need to make 50 phone calls a day, but everyone's business has changed. And I would say, well, reply back to your boss that it just ain't working. They keep telling us we still got to make our call quotas and all those types of things. And, people are still thinking in terms, the Institute for Excellence in Sales, for example, we were famous for live events, and people right now are still not interested in getting up early in the morning and going to a hotel for an event if they're not even going to the office. So we've had to pivot a couple of times. I want to talk about empathy for a second. Sure. We had a great moment, and it's interesting what you said, because even though yes, we should be, sales is all about empathy, and it really is all about creative. And the great salespeople are extremely creative, coming up with ideas, coming up with solutions, figuring out new ways to get other people in the customer site involved with their process. But we were either operating on such rote behaviors and what was working, let's just keep doing it. Empathy was a great example. I remember right before the pandemic, I did a show with a woman named Alyssa Merwin, who's the VP of LinkedIn US. She might have been on your show. I don't know.
Well, scheduled, but had to cancel. So I think she had COVID, actually. So, yeah.
She also had a baby in the last couple of years, but just a fascinating sales leader. And this was right before the pandemic. I used to do all my interviews face to face. And she talked about how she was a great sales leader because she was vulnerable. And she said she was vulnerable to a T to her people, and sharing anything and being totally transparent with what was going on. And that was such a highly listened to show, because that was a relatively new thing for a sales leader to admit. So then pandemic kicks in, and then the big word of the day was empathy. We did a show but we're now talking about it. Every single show. We did a show in June of 2020. And, in the heyday of the lockdown, Andy Paul, we were getting 200 people every day watching us, do the interview like this. Now we get 2. Everybody listens now. They're back to listening to the podcast. But we got a question from the audience, which was, I'm tired of being empathetic. When can we start turning off the empathy? And the guest who was on the show, his name is Dan Cole, just a seasoned sales leader. He said, if you're feeling that way, you better take the week off, because you better go to the beach and listen to music and look at the ocean, because sales is all about being empathetic and understanding what the customer's going through.
Yeah. Yeah. Tired of being empathetic. Well, my first reaction to that was, well, yeah, they're not being empathetic. They're tired of something, but they're not tired of being empathetic.
Well, because they put a definition on something, and it's kind of like, when you learn how to do anything, play the guitar, play pickleball, whatever it might be, you're thinking, okay, I need to move my arm back, swing through. I can't be standing there. I need to move there. I need to move here. In the beginning, we started telling people, you need to be empathetic. You've never thought about it before. Here's the word you need to be empathetic. And okay, I need to be empathetic. I'm on the call. How are you? We could see people having to think through what it meant, even though it's the core of what great sales professionals do. I'll give you a quote here from one of your, someone that you've worked very closely with, the great Howard Brown, of revenue.io. Empathy, it's not only critical to understand what it is, it's critical to understand what it's not. Empathy is the ability to understand someone else's emotions, their feeling, and their situation. It's critical in my relationship with my wife, with my children, with my coworkers, with my partners, and with my customers. And it is critical because we all want to be heard.
Yeah. And so I write about this in my book as well. And you and I may have talked about it on your show is there are various forms of empathy. And the thing is that we train salespeople, if we train them at all, in empathy, in a form that's called compassionate empathy, which is the one that we're most familiar with. And you sort of address this a little bit in chapter 7 of the book, is, I understand how you feel, right? I understand how you feel. And yeah, to some degree, when you say that, you're making someone feel heard. But there's a great book written about empathy by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy. And he made the case that, we are misled by a reliance on compassionate empathy, because he describes a second form, which is cognitive empathy, which is understanding not just how they feel, but why they feel the way they do, right? And without the why, you don't have enough information to take action to help them feel differently, which is what you're trying to do as a seller. And so, we train people on this compassion. It's great to be compassionate for people. We need compassion in the world, but Bloom talks about in his book is, unfortunately, like he gives example of policymakers in countries and so on. They're making policy decisions based on trying to alleviate how the suffering perhaps people feel, but don't understand why they're feeling it, and so don't have the information to say, well, let's make a better policy decision. And similar in sales is, I want to understand how you're feeling, but more importantly, I want to understand why you feel the way you do. Why is this a pain point for you? Why is this a challenge for you in business? Why? And then with that, then I can have a better handle on, well, what should the solution, or what could potentially the solution be?
A couple things come to mind as you say that. I want to give another quote in that chapter. It was from a VP of sales at Microsoft, and his name is Javier Vasquez. He's in their public sector, I think mostly federal division. And he gave a great quote. We don't want to use empathy as a weapon. It's a valuable sales tool in a sense that it helps you get to the core of what your customer challenges are, and you could offer a solution back, but we can't weaponize it, meaning that you use empathy to just get what you want. Real empathy is a two-way street of extending emotions to each other. So, that was a fantastic quote. We had a lot of you need to be empathetic and focus on some of the things that you had just alluded to. But I really enjoyed Javier's comment where he was talking about, it's not a tool in the sense that, okay, I'm going to ask great questions. I'm going to be empathetic. 14 minutes into the call, I'm going to turn on my empathy. It reminds me of two great things that I thought they were great that came through in the podcast. One is the expression, wait. Why am I talking? And that's become a big thing over the last year. People talk a lot about listening, and people, as listen for the opportunity to talk. Right. But, the concept of wait, why am I talking? And the other quote that there's a lot of quotes, like you probably had tons that have stuck with you. It was a quote from a VP of sales I think he's VP of sales training now at a company called JG Wentworth. They're the company that buys and sells. Yeah, exactly. 3:00 in the morning commercials. They're the company that buys your settlements, either insurance or lottery. And Gary Millwit is his name. And he made a great quote. He said, at the end of every podcast, Andy, I ask people, give us one action step. You've given us 20 great ideas. Give us one thing specific. He said, make everybody you talk to feel important. Right. Brilliant quote. Here's the thing too, is we're talking about a lot of this stuff, and, you get very deep, as do we on the Sales Game Changers podcast. A lot of this stuff, it might seem, yes, be empathetic, be a better listener. Well, we want to get deep into, because not everyone's naturally thinking that. They think sometimes that, even good young salespeople, that their ability to be successful is their energy or their charisma. And the reality is it's really understanding what your customer is needing to achieve. You mentioned curiosity. Have you ever had Allison Horstmeyer on your show? Dr. Allison Horstmeyer?
No.
You should check her out. Curiosity comes up a lot. I'll ask the VPs of sales, why are you so great? Why have you been so successful in sales? And typically there's two things that they'll say. One is, I'm a great listener. Okay. And let's get a little bit deeper. Why are you a great listener? What should we tell people listening to the Sales Game Changers podcast to do to be a better listener? And the other is what you just brought up before, which is, I'm curious. I have an insatiable curiosity. So I was seeking an expert on curiosity. Her name is Dr. Allison Horstmeyer. I did a show with her earlier this year in 2022, and we got deep into what it really means to be curious and how you could be genuinely curious. And it was a fascinating show.
So what'd she say?
Well, basically, it really goes down to deeply understanding what your customers' missions are and really having a passion. You know, one thing when people ask me, what would be my number one tip for them being successful in sales? I always say the same thing. Number one, really, really become an expert in your customer's industry. You know, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and there's a neighborhood called Great Falls that has these humongous houses. And, you know, I always tell people there's three types of people who live in those houses. The lobbyists up on, you know, Capitol Hill, you know, a lot of the corporate attorneys, and the guy who sells Dell computers to the Air Force, right? And the guy who sells Sony monitors to the Navy, right? Because DC is, even though we have multiple industries like media,
Government's the business.
Yeah, government, it's Fortune 1. So, you know, and you don't become the guy who sells Dell to the Air Force. It's a 20-year journey being deeply integrated into the federal marketplace, technology into the federal marketplace. And, you know, one of the first things is you got to be so deeply curious about what the mission of your customer is. What are they trying to achieve, not just today, but 5 years from now, right? You know, why is the Navy doing this? And when you can ask your customers those introspective questions, and those questions aren't, gee, tell me the mission of the Navy. You know, those curious questions are, hey, I just understand that you guys just got, you know, we just putting out a new $200 million program for whatever it might be. How is that going to impact Pacific North, you know, Pacific, Asia Pacific, you know, entreaties or whatever it might be. So it's, I mean, she talked about a lot of things, but one thing that stuck with me was really understanding, and the great sales professionals, they're not great because they sell Dell. They're great because they bring solutions to a specific market, which has allowed them to have nice 5, 10, 20, 30-year careers. And if you're at the right place, which goes to luck, I guess, you know, if you're selling for the right company at the right time, you know, 2 years ago, if you were selling popcorn to movie theaters, it was a pretty difficult place to be, even if you were the number one popcorn seller on the planet. But if you're selling Dell to the Navy, you have a pretty good life, and you've earned it.
And you've earned it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the curiosity is I distinguish it from understanding, right? I mean, it's the precursor to understanding. But I think the problem with curiosity, and there's people have written about this recently, I don't say problem with curiosity, is something we need to watch out for, let's say, is that what we do is we train curiosity out of people. So this could happen at various stages in your life. I mean, anybody ever said to you, oh, Fred, enough with the questions, just do what you're told. And I think we see this in sales because, hey, here's our playbook. Here's the questions we ask. Have you made your calls? It's like, yeah, don't question this. This is the process. Just go do it. But it starts at an early age, you know, in school and you know, we're so big into conformity. We want people to conform, both societally and in sales. Well, conformity is the enemy of curiosity. And so, you know, people have this incentive. Let's just, you know, I got to go execute this process. And it's like, well, sure you can. They'll get you to a certain point, but you're absent your curiosity. And I think the curiosity is tied into, to some degree, with the vulnerability that you talked about before, is what holds people back from asking sometimes the in-depth questions they need to be able to ask is they don't want to ask a dumb question. They don't want to make themselves vulnerable, right? When instead, you know, that level of vulnerability, that question you ask that you're concerned might be a dumb question to a buyer, actually has value to them.
No, that is a great, I mean, that's a great point. And, you know, it's, I remember I used to, in one part of my career, I was in marketing, and a big thing we did was like video customer stories. And, you know, we would, you know, those kind of testimonials, I guess, whatever they would be. The one thing that I realized was when a guy is a CTO of a company or a CIO he goes home, his spouse, or the other way around, if she's a CTO or a CIO, the spouse usually isn't asking, "Hey, Sonny, honey, what's the latest thoughts on the architecture that you guys are looking to implement?" So it doesn't happen. So you, as the sales professional or the marketing person, when you're asking a CIO's a thoughtful question, because back to the preparation that we talked about before, and the curiosity, and not just the curiosity, but the genuine interest. If you want to be successful in sales, you got to be genuinely interested in what your customers are going to be doing. Because here's the thing that not everybody thinks about, especially in the early part of their career. Sales is a journey. A lot of people think, sales isn't, gee, I'm going to make one phone call and close a $100,000 deal. It may take you 2-3 years. I mean, think about the example you used before. It was 2 years before you finally got that customer to say, yeah, I think we're ready right now. So if you had asked that question, well, you did ask that question 2 years prior, and the answer was either silence or no, or
no, I didn't even bother to ask at that point because I knew we wouldn't be considered. But
But then it's the same thing. It's like, sales, especially the sales that we're talking about here, it's a journey. And back to the urgency, it's such a beautiful thing when both things come together. You're at the right place and the customer is at the right place. And you've proven time and time again that you're a word we haven't discussed here, trusted advisor, trusted partner, that's going to put you in position because of all the stuff that you've done. And, maybe it's, asking questions throughout. Hey, I noticed this article about your competitor. What are your thoughts? Just keeping it going with showing that you care and genuinely, customers will see through the BS, but, genuinely being interested. All the great sales leaders, Andy, that I've come across, they have that genuine curiosity, the genuine interest in what the customer is doing. I don't really have this in the book, but one of the questions that I almost always ask, especially when a sales leader has had a 30-year run in public sector or finance or healthcare, they've sold to those industries. I always say, you've been selling to public sector for 30 years, federal, education, healthcare. Why is that? And they don't say, well, it's a lucrative marketplace. And they always, and of course it is, but they always say, I really believe in the mission of the customer. For whatever the reason might be, like you talked about before, for whatever their life looked like, to be passionate. Maybe their father was in the military, maybe their mother had cancer and died when they were a child, or, maybe their parents were teachers and they, saw the challenges that their parents had, earning a lot of money as teachers, whatever it might have been,
right.
Whatever the story is, but it's the mission to the customer. And I always get chills. When someone says to me, I'm committed to how the Department of Energy or Department of the EPA is trying to make the world a cleaner place, or is trying to get rid of emissions or whatever the thing might be. And it's like, yeah, I feel that you're passionate, not because you want to sell a lot, but because that you're helping the world become a better place. Is that what sales is about? Service at the end of the day?
Well, it is.
We could go for another hour talking about a lot of these topics.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just not sure how many think they're saving the world or making the world a better place by doing it. But nice if you could. I mean, I know there are people I have clients, people are selling life-saving medical devices. They feel a sense of mission. Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to make the world better for salespeople. That's hardly life-saving. But, there are people who, they feel that mission and that's great.
I want to go back to something you just said. I want to correct what you just said. We run a women in sales program, and it's a global program to help women in sales improve as leaders at companies like Salesforce and Amazon Web Services, Oracle. We've had about 150 women around the world go through our program, Andy Paul. And I've had 65, 70 of them. And I don't run the program. I have a woman named Gina Stracuzzi who's amazing, who has co-created and runs that program. I've had about 60 to 70 women who've reached out to me and said, this program has changed my life. It's not just made me a better sales professional or a sales leader for my company, which is great. It's made my home life happier.
Oh, so yeah. I think change the world. We change people for sure. I mean, that is important.
And if one person changes, the world changes. So that's true. Think what you're, what you're doing and what you've done with over 1,000 episodes of the various podcasts, that you've run, and the writing and the articles and the blogs and the training, I'm going to say that you've impacted hundreds of thousands of lives for the better.
Yeah. No, I was talking about world change, but yes. Yeah, no, it is one of the things that I have a tremendous amount of gratitude for. It's just that people people are open to ideas, right? I mean, and that you're able to have an impact on people and that people appreciate it. And yeah, that's why you and I continue doing this is it's not for ego gratification. A lot of easier ways to get that.
Yeah. As we wrap, do you mind if I talk about my other book real quickly?
Well, sure. Let's do that because we hadn't mentioned up front, but you are publishing actually 2 new books. Actually, I think today is the publication day, or yesterday was when we're recording this. But let's talk about that because it's not a sales book.
No, it's not. We're actually recording today's show in the middle of August. I have a second book. It's called Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. And I have someone in my life who has chronic Lyme disease. It's an epidemic. Lyme is a tick-borne illness. Mm-hmm. It's a global epidemic. They say that 15% of the people on the planet have either had Lyme disease or have Lyme disease.
15%?
1 out of every 7 people. Wow. Ticks are killing moose in Maine. Ticks are all over the place. There's no real cure for chronic Lyme disease. If you have a tick bite and you have some symptoms of Lyme and the doctor knows that it's Lyme, you'll take some antibiotics and it should be taken care of within a couple of weeks. But there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who didn't get the Lyme diagnosed properly. Maybe they were bit 20 years ago, couldn't figure out for 10, 20 years that they even had Lyme disease. So I had somebody in my life who has chronic Lyme disease. And when I decided to really understand what Lyme disease survivors go through, I wrote a couple blog articles for an organization called LymeDisease.org. Mm-hmm. And eventually it led to a book, which I just referred to. It's an interesting thing. I launched both books on the same day, Insights for Sales Game Changers and Love, Hope, Lyme. I'm the only person in history who's done a book on sales performance improvement and tick-borne illness awareness. But they're both kind of similar. We used the word empathy before. Mm-hmm. They're both created to help people improve their lives and their livelihood. So if anybody out there has anyone in their life who has either chronic Lyme disease, and so people have said, this book works if you have someone in your life with a chronic illness that is slowing them down. Pick it up. Love, Hope, Lyme. It's on Amazon, and I'm very proud of the book.
Yeah, well, and thank you for writing it. I mean, I think that I've had at least a couple people on the show who have actually children that have been suffering for a long time with chronic Lyme disease, going undiagnosed for long periods of time or incorrectly diagnosed, as you mentioned. Yep. And it was an eye-opener for me because I'm California-based for the most part. It's not as prevalent out there. And you don't hear about it as often as you do perhaps back here on the East. And yeah, it's a real eye-opener because just how devastating an illness it can become.
Yeah, it for the people listening here, it's a bacteria. It's transmitted from animals via ticks into humans, and the bacteria gets into all of your organs. Like I said, if you figure it out quickly, the antibiotics will kill it within a couple of weeks. But if it goes beyond that, it's going to be a very, very difficult haul. And when I say every organ, including the brain, and that's where it gets really, really challenging. Especially you mentioned children. I've met so many people whose children have, because children are out playing, in the woods. And one of the reasons why it's prevalent is because the deer population has grown unencumbered, over the last 2 decades. But here nor there, the other thing too, as I wrote the book, it also, when we think about sales, we think about obstacles. Everyone in sales, even the most successful person, has had obstacles. The customer calls and says, like you used the example before, well, you've been working on this project, but we decided we're not going to move ahead with it for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. Or we've canceled the project. You've worked for 2 years on a project, and for whatever the reason, the customer calls and says, we just lost the budget, or we're going in a different direction. Right. Yeah. So, okay. All right. Well, gee, that's an obstacle. Or the customer ghosts you and doesn't call you back, or you find out that your main contact is no longer at the customer. You know, all these obstacles, objections that we have to deal with. when I thought about it, when I learned what people with Lyme go through, that's a huge obstacle. It's making it through the day.
It's a real obstacle.
It's a real obstacle.
Yeah.
And, I did a podcast interview today with a woman named Anahid Durian who sells, she's in rare disease pharmacology, pharmaceuticals. And she's been a sales professional for 20 years. She has chronic Lyme disease. And she talked about the challenges. She doesn't have all the symptoms, but she talked about the challenges that she goes through every day. And as I'm listening to this podcast and I'm reading the transcript, it's real world. Can I get out of bed today?
Yes.
People can't get out of bed sometimes for weeks. And to be in sales, the hardest profession at any company, to overcome the usual stuff that we have to deal with, and then to have to overcome, something like this, it's quite remarkable. There aren't too many people who've been able to do that and do it successfully, but it gave me a deeper appreciation for, all right, if we have obstacles along the way to the sale, let's figure them out quickly. Let's put a plan in place. Let's go to plan B quickly. You can't get rid of chronic Lyme disease or other chronic illnesses quickly. So you have to figure out, how do I have this and be successful? It's a challenge.
Yeah, but it's absolutely. But it speaks back to what we were talking about before. So it's just keeping things in perspective.
Yeah.
And you talk about this in the book. Emotional intelligence and emotion management and so on is so critical. And it's so hard, right? I mean, it is I think one of the bigger challenges for sellers is, keep things in context, right? Yeah, there are things that are real barriers, like having a chronic disease that affects your ability to get out of bed or move or have the energy you need. Customer deciding they're going to wait 2 months to order something is not of the same magnitude. Yeah. And if you can learn how to deal with that, then that helps you a lot.
Yeah, and once again, just to wrap up, I mean, it's the thing that I've learned from the Sales Game Changers podcast, interviewing over 550 people, is to get to the highest level of sales, you have to be a professional. And I tell people this all the time. What does a professional do in anything to be a professional? If you're a professional golfer, you're working on your putting 5 hours a day, right? You're at the driving range for 2 hours at 10 o'clock at night.
You're learning.
You're learning and you're preparing. And so many salespeople don't do all the things necessary. Hopefully, there's a bunch of people listening to today's show who are going to take the lessons that you've taught over 1,000 episodes and the lessons that I've talked about over 550 episodes, and in my new book, Insights for Sales Game Changers, and your new book. And they read it and they just don't rip it. They practice it. They write it down. It's like, I'm going to implement what Andy Paul says in chapter 3 today, and I'm going to implement what Fred talks about in chapter 10 about sales mindset. I'm going to implement some of these things because I truly want to become a more successful sales professional. Yeah.
Well, I mean, last point, I'll take it back to curiosity. Mm-hmm. It's preparation is curiosity. You're learning. That's what your preparation is. I can learn about the prospect, learn about their business. Curiosity is driving that, right? Want to connect with somebody? Well, I want to learn about that person. What are the things that are interesting to them? And I have these great technologies available through LinkedIn and other places to be able to do that. A great quote, which I'm sure I'll simplify it, is someone once asked Kobe Bryant, who is legendary for the amount of work he did on the court and the gym, outside the games to prepare himself and so on. And they said, well, what's the greatest contributor toward your success? He said, curiosity. Who would have thought? A basketball player. Curiosity.
I have a great Kobe Bryant story in the book. Someone I interviewed, his name is Alan Stein Jr. He's an elite basketball coach, and now he is an elite leadership coach. And he wrote a book called Raise Your Game. And I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he tells a Kobe Bryant story that when Alan Stein Jr. was a basketball coach, he went to a cohab where they had all these elite high school players, and Kobe Bryant was one of the instructors. And Alan Stein Jr. walked up to Kobe and said, I'd like to introduce myself. Can I just watch you practice? I just want to watch you for whatever. And Kobe said, yeah, sure. Meet me at 4:00 tomorrow morning 4 o'clock in the morning at the gym at the end of the street. So Alan Stein said he got up at 2 o'clock because he didn't want to be late and he didn't want to walk in at the wrong time. So Alan Stein says he got there at 3. And as he's walking to the gym, he noticed the lights were on and he could hear, the quiet sound of a ball bouncing and, the squeaking of sneakers. And he walks in and Kobe's practicing at 3 o'clock in the morning. And he said he sat back in the corner just to observe. And then, he watched Kobe from 4 to 5, whatever. And, he said, I thought you told me to be here at 4. He said, yeah, I got here at 3. Who was up at 3 o'clock in the morning, Andy Paul, practicing anything, right? Yeah. Arguably one of the 5 greatest players, may he rest in peace, by the way, was up at 3 o'clock in the morning working. And he wasn't working, Alan Stein Jr. said he wasn't working on 360 dunks. He wasn't working on 50-yard 3-pointers. He was working on slight moves, moves for people. I'm sorry?
Experimenting,
but little tiny things. And he said, he realized that it's not the 360 dunks that made Kobe who he is. It's the inch over that gave him a millisecond speed advantage to the guy who was defending him. And those are the things we need to be practicing and be curious about doing as well.
Yeah. Well, it's true in sales I like to ask sellers. I said, so your last deal you won, how much did you win by? Never ask a seller, quantify how much better they were than the opposition. It has nothing to do with pricing, right?
Yeah.
How much did you win by? What was your margin of victory? Well, it only has to be 0.5%, right? Or a fraction of a percent better than the other. And that's exactly what Kobe was doing. He didn't have to be 15% better. He's just trying to find those little edges. So, and everything we talked about today contributes to creating those edges. So, Fred, thank you so much for joining me. And if people want to connect with you or learn more about where they can buy the book, obviously at Amazon, but fill them in.
The best way to reach me is LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I have a website, of course, thefreddiamond.com. We have salesgamechangers.podcast.com, and the institute is i4espd.org. But the best way is LinkedIn or Facebook. I'm actually, since the Lyme book has come about, Andy Paul, when I first started writing the Lyme book, I wrote a couple blog articles for LymeDisease.org. And one was on how to be a supportive partner to somebody with Lyme. And my Facebook friends have increased by 1,000 with people who are trying to help Lyme survivors make it through the day. And since the book came out, so if you're interested on Facebook, reach me out there as well.
All right, perfect. Fred, thank you. Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I am so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank our guest, Fred Diamond, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.